Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of CSI 1130 Intro to Java Programming. In this video, I'm going to talk again about classes. In the last video, we got an introduction to classes. You learned that a class is going to be a collection of data and services, and you can make instances of that class and use it over and over and over and over and over again. We talked about that relationship between a blueprint and a house, whereas the class is like the blueprint, the house is like the object or the instance of that class. We drew a checkerboard, and you saw that checkerboard get used over and over and over again. This time I'm going to make a series of address fields that I'm going to use for input. I'm going to run the program really quickly so you can see how it works. Here's what I have. My applet consists of two sets of address fields, a home set of fields and a work set of fields. In the home fields, I've got name, street, city, state, and zip. In the work fields, I have name, street, city, state, and zip. The way it's going to work is I'm going to enter some stuff. And once I enter those things into the fields, those values into the fields, I click submit, and it's going to pull them over to the JText area. You can see that here, home and then work, and then print them out. Let's see how the code works. I'm going to start with Address Applet. Address Applet is going to be a JApplet. It's going to implement action listener. It's going to have two sets of address fields. Address fields is a class that I created. And we'll get to that in a little bit. It's got a border layout. It's got a JPanel called output panel, a JPanel called bottom panel, a JPanel called address panel. It's got a JText area called output, a scroll pane, which we have not seen JScroll pane yet, or maybe we have, I don't recall. I'm going to explain it anyways. And it's got two JButtons, and it's got a string called output string. I want you to make sure you have this file open, or I should say this program open in JCreator. Just like always, you can find these lecture files in D2L. You should always have them open while I'm showing the videos. So get it open. If you don't, pause the video and open it up. If you do, well, let's just move on. In init, what I do is I set the border layout, or I create my border layout here, instantiating my border layout object into the border layout variable. And then I pass that variable into set layout, thereby setting the layout of my apple to border layout. And I call three methods: setup output, setup buttons, setup addresses. You might notice that in almost all the videos that I create, whenever I'm doing a GUI, I break my GUI creation down into separate methods. The reason I do this is because it makes the code a little bit more clean. I've been seeing in projects students just throwing all of their GUI creation into the init, and your init gets super long, it's really messy, it's hard to parse through. If you have a problem in there, it can be hard to find that problem. Get in the habit of breaking up your GUI into chunks and then putting those chunks into separate methods. I like to break them up in terms of their functions. So the outputs are going to go into one method, buttons are going to go into another, and addresses are going to go into another. We'll take a look at setup addresses. I'm going to create a new JPanel in address panel, and it's going to use a box layout. We haven't talked about box layout, but the way box layout works is I have to have some sort of GUI component that's going to get passed into the box layout, which seems a little weird. We haven't done that before. We've only added we've set the layout to some sort of a GUI component. But with box layout, we have to pass that GUI component into the box layout before we actually set the layout, the box layout to that component. So box layout construction looks like this. Box layout, and I'm calling it box, new box layout, and then I pass the GUI component into it that I'm applying it to. So I'm applying the box layout to the address panel, so I have to pass the address panel into it. Then box layout can have either X or Y axis. X axis is going to be a box that will be wide. Y-axis will be a box that will be tall, so it'll stack them vertically. I'm using the box layout here to stack them vertically, because what's going to happen is I'm going to have two sets of address fields, and I'm going to stack them vertically in the west side of my border layout of the applet. So I'm creating my box layout here, and then I'm setting the layout of my address panel to box. So address panel is just going to contain my two sets of address fields. Home and work were the address fields. You might recall I declared them up here, address fields home and address fields work, and here I'm instantiating them. Home gets new address fields, and then I'm passing the value of a string, home, into one, and the other one I'm passing the value work into the other. I'd like to jump over now to the address fields class. This is an appropriate time to do that because I'm constructing objects of their type. So let's go look at the class that I created. Address fields. Public class address fields extends JPanel. You might recall this from the previous video. We extended JPanel for our checker pattern, and this time I'm extending JPanel for my address fields. Now the address fields is going to be a collection of JLabels, JText fields, JPanel, a grid layout, and a string. Okay? There might be some methods in here as well. It might have some functionality. It might have some things that are going to allow us to retrieve values from this class and set values from this class. So let's look at it. Bunch of JLabels: name, street, city, state, zip, and type label. And JText field: name, street, city, state, and zip. A JPanel called container, a grid layout called grid, and a string called address type. Now, I have something called a constructor here. We haven't seen constructors before. What a constructor does is it's going to set up the initial conditions of our class. It's kind of similar to how we've used init in the past, sort of, but not really. Constructors are not implicitly called like init or paint are. You have to explicitly call upon a constructor. Let's look at my constructor here. Public address fields, and then in the parameter, string type. A constructor is a special kind of method, and it's a special kind of method that's used for building an object of this class's type. The constructor name here has to exactly match the name of the class. Okay? That's how constructors are meant to be designed. The name has to be the same as the class. And you'll see over here in Address Applet, when I construct a new address fields object, home gets new address fields, I'm calling it just like I would a method, address fields, so it's got the same name and it's got the same signature. It passes a string into the parameter. That string comes into the constructor here. We use the parameter of a constructor to bring initial values into the instance of the class. So I'm going to have two instances of address fields. I'm going to have the one for home and the one for work. One of them, you'll see home string comes into the constructor. The other one, the work string, comes into the constructor. So what happens is that string, home or work, comes into type. Type gets assigned to address type. Now address type is just the type of address. I could have a home address, a work address, a school address, a secondary address, vacation home address. I could create all sorts of different address field objects, and each one would have to have a type, and it's just going to describe the type of address that it is. In this case, it's home and work are the two types of addresses we've created. So we use that constructor to bring in that string to set up the type. And let's see how that corresponds with the actual applet. That's what we see here. Home and work get displayed on these two labels, so the address type display on the labels in the applet. And we'll get to that in just a little bit. So my constructor, I'm using it to set up the initial conditions of some of my instance variables. I'm setting the value for address type to the value that came into the constructor. I'm creating a new JPanel inside of the container. I'm instantiating my grid layout. And the grid layout is instantiated to a 5-row by 2-column layout. We've seen grid layout in a previous unit and in a previous video, so I'm not going to belabor this one. I'm setting the layout of my address panel, my class, my JPanel, to border layout, and I'm setting the layout of the container to grid. Type label is going to get a new JLabel, and it's taking in the value of address type, and it's being centered in that JLabel. If we take a look at it at our applet here, here's what we're seeing here. We're seeing our grid layout, the 2x5. It's going to be each one of these address fields. So it's 2 columns by 5 rows. Name, street, city, state, and zip. Those are my 5 rows. My 2 columns are the labels column and the fields column. Okay? And then my type label shows up right up here or right up here. These are 2 different address fields instances. Each one is going to have their own set of fields and labels, and each are going to have their own label at the top. Okay, let's move on to create labels, create fields, add components. Those are the 3 methods that are going to happen. And all this does is it just sets up our fields. We've seen this before. It sets up our labels. We've seen this before, and it's going to set up our fields right here. This was not setting up the fields. This is a method I created called clear fields, and I'll get to that in a little bit and see how that works. Now I'm adding all the components. So I just add all the components to our container and then add the container to the border layout. All right? That's how our GUI is set up. I'm not going to go over this before. We've talked a lot about GUI design. I'm not going to waste our time on that. If you want to spend more time really studying this GUI, by all means, do so. Have that code open, study it, make sure you understand how that GUI is put together. The important things for this class are that it's got this constructor, and we saw how that works, and it's got this method here called clear fields. Let's look at the address applet. The address applet is going to, like I said, set up our addresses. So I created my 2 address fields objects, and they're using the constructor from the address fields class, like we saw, and then we're going to add them to the address panel. And then we add the address panel to border layout west. So that gets called there. Let's look at setup output. Setup output is just going to create a new JPanel. It's got a flow layout, it's the output panel, and it's going to create a new JText area called output. It's going to be 15 by 20, and we're creating a new JScroll pane. The JScroll pane is going to add a scroll bar, and it's going to put the JPanel in that scroll pane so that we can scroll up and down over that JText area, allowing us to go outside of the JText area. It's pretty cool. So we're adding the output panel to the JScroll pane, and then we add the JScroll pane to the output panel. After that, we add the output panel to our border layout in the center. Lastly, we set up buttons. Button panel gets new JPanel, it's set to flow layout. We set up our buttons, we add our buttons, we add the button panel to border layout south, and then we set our action listeners to submit and clear. You might find that I'm kind of rushing through talking about setting up the GUIs. I feel I don't need to spend a lot of time talking about GUIs. We've spent a lot of time on it previously. If you really want to dig into this code and look at it, have it open, pause the video, study it in depth, make sure you know how all those GUI components get set up. Maybe have the applet open so you can kind of compare how things are getting set up so you understand the way that this GUI is laid out. Let's take a look at action performed. Action performed is going to get the source of our action event, and I've got 2 buttons. It's submit and clear. So I'm going to save that into an event button called JButton. If that event button is submit, I'm going to build my output string, and then I'm going to append output string to the output panel, and then I'll reset the output string. Okay? I'll look at build output string in just a minute. It's kind of a big one, so I didn't want to put it all there. And then if the event button is clear, I'm going to call on output set text that. Afterwards, I'm going to call on clear fields for both home and work. So you've seen that classes can have methods. Here is a method that I created in the address fields class, and I'm calling it on my 2 objects. Let's look at that method. home.clearFields. So I'm clearing the fields for the home object only here, and I'm clearing the fields for the work object here. Okay? Let's look at how it works. Clear fields is going to set the text of all of my fields to empty quotes, thereby clearing those out. Okay, it's not going to append it, it's not going to add empty quotes onto it, it's going to replace what was in that field with empty quotes. Let's take a look at how this works. I'm going to comment out the work one for a second. I'm going to run it, put some values in here. Submit, and you'll notice when I submit, before it cleared all the fields from all of them. This time I commented out the work clear fields, and it only cleared the fields for home. These two sets of fields are individually working, individually acting sets of data and services. They're two separate instances of two separate classes, so they can behave independently from one another. They both will hold their own data. Home will hold all of this data. Work will hold all of this data. That's how classes work. It allows me to set aside memory locations that are going to hold all of this data. And I might have a million different sets of addresses. And that might not be uncommon. You might have very large databases, like the US government has databases for every home address for everybody living in the United States. Presumably, I'm guessing they do. There's census data. Well, each one of those addresses would have its own address entry. You can think of that as being like an instance of a class, whereas address is a class. Well, each of those entries in the census data would be an instance from that class. Each of them behaving differently, each one for a different person, each one for a different family or a different home. That's how classes and objects work. So I have two separate objects here, a home object and a work object, and they behave independently of one another. I'm going to go CH, street is that, city is that, state is that, and zip is that. And when I submit it, you'll see the home one holds a different value from the work one. They behave independently of one another. When I hit clear, it clears out the console. Okay? So I'm going to uncomment that so now you can see that they will both work normally just like before. But that was just to demonstrate that these two instances of these objects behave independently. Last thing I want to show you is building the string. I'm not going to go over everything. What this is doing is just putting together one long string for home text and one long string for work text, and then concatenating them together. We've seen how to get text from text fields, and that's how we're doing it here. So I'm going to home.nameField.getText. Okay, so what I'm doing here is I'm accessing the name field from the home object. That's the crucial part of this. Now, let's look at how we access the data from the work field. Work.getNameField.getText. So I'm accessing the work object here. I'm accessing the home object here. This is how we specify which object we're pulling data from. So if you look at all the home text stuff, it's home.nameField, home.streetField.getText, home.cityField.getText, home.stateField.getText, home.zipField.getText. I'm pulling all the stuff from those home objects. And down here, work name field, work street field, work city field, work state field, work zip field. And I'm getting the text from all those fields that exist within those objects. So the way this works is I've got my object specifier, the object that I'm choosing, and then the field within, or the variable within that object. So name field is a variable inside of my home object. I'm accessing name field here in the home object. And here, I'm calling getText to that name field. Okay? That's how we work with objects, and that's how we work with methods inside of objects. That's how we work with directly accessing variables inside of objects. So you can either use the dot operator to access methods inside of an object, or you can use the dot operator to access variables within an object. So to summarize, we built this class that's going to store a bunch of data fields. It's going to store a bunch of data for addresses and names. And you've seen how we instantiate objects right here using the constructors. And you've seen how we call methods to those individual objects. And you saw how they behaved independently. And then you saw how we accessed variables within an object. This is going to be a really useful set of skills for the next project. And actually all kind of object-oriented programming that you do from here on out, you're going to be doing this stuff. Creating objects, working with variables from those objects, and working with methods from those objects. Thanks for watching.